It's another day with a lot happening in Ukraine and Russia due to the Russian invasion. The news says withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine. United Nations General Assembly demands. 1 million refugees escaped from Ukraine in weeks since invasion. Japanese car makers, airlines cut ties with Russia amidst war in Ukraine. Modi-Putin talks plight of Indian students stuck in Ukraine. And Russia is bracing for a powerful change in its standard of living. Hello out there, this is Echo Television Africa, and it's got a roundup of top stories now on International News Desk. I am Lois Turaki. Thanks for tuning in. I begin tonight with majority of the nations in the world have voted in favor of a United Nations resolve challenging that Russia instantly, completely and unconditionally call out its military forces from Ukraine in a strong rebuke of Moscow's attack of its neighbor. On Wednesday, the resolution was adopted at a sporadic emergency session of the United General Assembly, and it was backed by 141 of the UN's 193 members. Amongst the 35 countries that refrained is China, India, and South Africa, while just 5 countries, Eritrea, North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and of course Russia, voted against it. The resolution deplores Russia's offensive against Ukraine and condemns President Vladimir Putin's decision to put his nuclear forces on alert. Although General Assembly's resolves are non-binding, they carry political weight, with Wednesday's vote representing a symbolic victory for Ukraine and increasing Moscow's international isolation. Even Serbia, Russia's traditional ally, voted against it. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the General Assembly's message was loud and clear. End hostilities, silence the guns in Ukraine now. As bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb, he said in a statement. Almost every General Assembly speaker unreservedly condemned the war. If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war, said the United States United Nations envoy Linda Thomas-Greenfield. According to her, Russia was preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign and was moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, including cluster munitions and vacuum bombs. Sergei Kislytsia, Ukraine's United Nations envoy, called the resolution one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop the Russian invasion and urged countries to support the text, saying Russia have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist, adding that it's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation, only it is genocide. The United Nations still said more than 1 million people have escaped Ukraine in the week since Russia's attack, with one official warning that at this rate, the mass exit could become the biggest refugee crisis this century. The tally on Thursday from the United Nations High Court Commissioner for Refugees UNHCR sums to at least 2% of Ukraine's population, which the World Bank totaled 44 million at the end of 2020, on move across borders in just 7 days. The agency warned that the outflows were far from ending, saying it has projected that as many as 4 million people could sooner or leave Ukraine, and even that prediction could be reviewed upward. Gedini Williams, a spokeswoman for the UNHCR, said, according to reports from an email, that our data shows we passed the 1 million mark as of midnight in Central Europe, based on counts collected by national authorities. Filippo Grandi, UN National High Commissioner, on Twitter wrote, in just 7 days, we have witnessed the migration of 1 million refugees from Ukraine to neighboring countries. For many millions more inside Ukraine, it's time for guns to fall silent so that life-saving humanitarian assistance can be provided, he added. As the sound of artillery fire, exploding mortar shells, and gunfire echoed across the country, Grandi's comments attested to the fear of civilians in Ukraine, as well as the rising concern of a humanitarian disaster by United Nations agencies such as the World Health Organization and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The daily figures point to the dizzying speed of the evacuation. After over 82,000 people fled on the first day of the invasion on February 24th, each day afterwards resulted in at least 117,000 new refugees, hitting a peak of nearly 200,000 on Tuesday alone, based on the latest UNHCR count. Thus far, United Nations officials and others have largely praised the reaction from Ukraine's neighbors that have opened homes, gymnasiums, and other facilities to take in the new refugees. More than half of those leaving Ukraine went to Poland and more than 116,000 to Hungary to the south, according to the United Nations data. Moldova has taken in more than 79,000 and 71,200 have gone to Slovakia. Now, highest Japanese car makers have stopped exports to Russia, and Japanese airlines suspended flights to Europe as more firms in the Asian country change operations in reaction to the war in Ukraine. The world's top-selling car maker Toyota on Thursday said it will halt exports to Russia and production in the country as Western-led sanctions against Moscow twisted logistics and disconnected supply chains. The move comes after local rivals Honda and Mazda declared a suspension of exports to Russia, citing similar difficulties in procuring parts and logistical hurdles. Mitsubishi said it may halt production and sales in Russia, while Nissan said it will continue operations in the country while monitoring the situation there. Toyota said in a statement, the company is watching the ongoing developments in Ukraine with great concern for the safety of people of Ukraine and hopes for a safe return to peace as soon as possible. The car maker is Russia's top Japanese brand, producing about 80,000 vehicles at its St. Petersburg plant, which employs 2,000 staff. Meanwhile, Japan Airplanes and Airlines and ANA Holdings said they will stop all flights to and from Europe on Thursday, citing safety concerns amid heavy fighting in Ukraine. The airlines, which usually use Russian airspace for their Europe flights, join a growing number of carriers that have cancelled or rerouted flights between Europe and Northern Asia in the wake of the crisis. More on Russia and Ukraine crisis, says Vladimir Putin, Russian president, has held talks with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the immediate evacuation of Indian students stuck in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, the Kremlin says. According to a Kremlin statement on Wednesday, during their video call, Putin said he had ordered Russian soldiers to ensure the safe exit of Indian nationals from the armed conflict zone and their return to their homeland. Russia was trying to organize the emergency evacuation of a group of Indian students from Kharkiv via a humanitarian corridor, it added. Indian students that fled Ukraine rest in a sports hall near Bucharest. The Ukrainian authorities on Wednesday said Russian paratroopers had landed in the eastern city and that there was fighting in the streets. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry on Wednesday said the Ukrainian authorities were holding a group of Indian students by force. They have practically been taken hostage, ministry spokesperson Igor Konashenkov said during a televised briefing. But on Thursday, reports from India media said New Delhi has denied reports of its students being held as hostage in Ukraine. India's foreign ministry said it was in constant touch with Indian nationals in Ukraine, reports added. Russian Defense Ministry spokesperson Konashenkov said Ukraine was offering to evacuate the Indian student via the western border with Poland, which he said will mean they will be passing through combat zones. India is trying to organize the safe evacuation of some 12,000 of its citizens. Before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine last Thursday, there were 20,000 Indians in Ukraine. Indian authorities said since then, however, about 8,000 have succeeded to leave the country and about 1,400 of them have already been sent home. Still, Russians are preparing for a powerful change in their standard of living as their savings reduce in value and imports of everyday goods are quickly being cut off as Western sanctions take root. Several Western companies have abandoned their Russian operations to avoid running afoul of sanctions over the past week. They are also heading off potential PR quagmires that could result from maintaining ties to a country that's increasingly seen as a pariah on the global stage. Apple said it had stopped selling all of its products in Russia on Tuesday, following same moves by car and truck makers including Ford, General Motors, Volvo, Renault, and Jaguar. Western oil giants Shell and BP ended joint ventures with Russian counterparts earlier this week. Disney, along with Warner Media, CNN's parent company, are pausing the release of films in Russia. Intensifying the economic pain, two of the world's biggest container shipping companies, Maersk and MSC, said they are pausing cargo bookings to and from Russia, with the exception of food, medicine, and humanitarian supplies. On February 28th, freight trains stand on the halt at the Munich, Germany North Marshalling Yard following the attack on Ukraine. Western countries have enforced numerous sanctions, and the EU has imposed an export ban on goods, technologies, and services for the aerospace industry. Those departures, combined with the plummeting value of the ruble, threaten to choke Russia's economy and deny Russians of vital foreign goods such as cars, cell phones, clothing, and food. Although Russia's economy is mainly driven by exports of oil and natural gas, it depends heavily on imports of ended consumer products. Russia's currency jumped by about 25% on Monday, and one ruble is now worth less than a penny. The weakened ruble will probably The weakened ruble will probably worsen inflation, which was already well above the central bank's target before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There are signs of panic already, with numerous reports of residents waiting in long lines for ATMs over the weekend. The central bank has avoided an equity sell-off by keeping the stock market closed this week. It has also more than doubled its key interest rate to 20% to try to stabilize the currency. More Stories says Georgia to quickly submit EU bid amidst Russia-Ukraine crisis. Georgia's ruling party has announced plans to immediately submit an application to join the European Union after the bloc's parliament backed Ukraine's bid for membership amid Russia's invasion. Chairman of the ruling Georgian Dream, Irakli Kobakis, said, according to reports on Wednesday, that his party's decision was based on the overall political context and the new reality. We call on the European Union bodies to make an emergency assessment of our application and grant Georgia the status of an EU candidate country. But the ruling party came under strong pressure from opposition parties after a similar move by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who won overwhelming backing from European legislators in a non-binding resolution commending the bloc's bodies grants Ukraine the status of candidate country. The MEP's vote on Ukraine was largely seen in Georgia as a window of opportunity to advance its own EU aspirations, a goal enshrined in the country's constitution. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has strengthened the West's focus on Georgia and Moldova, another former Soviet republic seeking EU membership. Some observers view these countries as possible targets for the Kremlin after Ukraine. Last week, Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili was in Paris and Brussels to argue for Europe's commitment to Ukraine being extended to Georgia. However, if granted candidate status, Georgia and Ukraine will face a protracted and complex accession process. They will have to implement sweeping reforms to comply with the 27-nation bloc's political and economic standards. Georgia's and Ukraine's efforts to have closer ties with the West have long enraged Russia. Tensions with Moscow closed in Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. Both Georgia and Ukraine have signed association agreements with the EU designed to bring them closer together economically and politically. The agreements also include free trade deals between the countries and the United the European Union, as well as visa-free travels for its nationals for a short stay in the Schengen area, but they give no guarantee for eventual membership. UAE attitude towards Ukraine war shows strong alliance with Russia. Following the Western world moves to diplomatically isolate Russia in widespread global condemnation over its war on Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, stands out as one of a few countries key to maintain a neutral, if not supportive, stance towards Moscow. It was among an overwhelming majority of states that supported a resolution at an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, reprimanding Russia over its invasion of Ukraine and demanding Moscow immediately withdraw its forces on Wednesday. That stood in blunt contrast with its decision on Friday during a UN Security Council UNSC meeting to abstain from a vote on a similar context. UAE Presidential Advisor Anwar Gargash said the Gulf state believes that taking sides will only lead to more violence and that the UAE's priority was to encourage all parties to resort to diplomatic action in a Twitter post on Sunday. Unlike the UNGA resolutions, which have politically weight but are generally not binding, those adopted by the UNSC, where Russia has veto power, are more consequential. Right now, we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going, the UAE's UN envoy Lena Nusibe said on Wednesday, a day after calling for space for a diplomatic off-ramp to be maintained and channels to remain open. According to Andreas Craig, an associate professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, the UAE's different votes reflect a balancing act it has chosen to adopt towards the Ukraine-Russia crisis and wider foreign policy issues. Highlighting the UAE's keenness to support Russia while appearing neutral in the conflict, Krieg pointed out that its vote in favor of the more symbolic UNGA resolution was because it was less likely to antagonize Russia compared to the UNSC one. Still ahead on the news, United Nations voices concern over vote on new Libyan Prime Minister. The United Nations has stated concern over reports that a vote in Libya's parliament to install a new government which risks triggering new fighting or return to territorial division fell short of the expected standards. In an emailed statement, the United Nations Secretary General spokesperson said there were reports that Tuesday's vote did not meet standards of transparency and procedure and of acts of intimidation before the session. The parliament plans to swear in Fathi Bashaga was a prime minister on Thursday through the incumbent Abdul Hamid Diba refuses to hand over power, with both sides having some military support in the capital. The spokesperson said as such, the United Nations is rather focused on renewing its push for elections, adding that UN Libya advisor Stephanie Williams will soon invite the parliament and an opposing political body with the High Council of State for discussions. The position of international powers will be crucial in the coming struggle for control of Libya's government and political process, with analysts pointing to the dangers of another full-blown war or another split between fighting administrations. Libya has been stuck in chaos since a NATO-backed uprising ousted longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The country was afterwards split between rival administrations based in Tripoli in the west and a Tobruk-based parliament in the east. Either the political nor the military coalitions that are crystallizing now exactly match those that fought from 2011 until a 2020 treaty, but any new conflict will again likely pit Eastern forces against a combination of Western groups. Diba's government was put in place a year ago through a United Nations-backed peace process targeted at resolving political problems through an election last year. But the vote did not take place amidst arguments over the constitutional framework that will govern the vote. However, the parliament has tried to take control over the process by saying Diba's term had expired and setting a course towards a referendum on a changed constitution and then elections in 2023. Now, opposition in Congo shuns government-backed dialogue. The opposition in Congo is shunning a dialogue organized by the government ahead of local and legislative elections in the Central African country. A coalition of parties discharged the meeting, which begins Thursday in Rwanda, in the country's north, as a stunt meant to avert attention from the numerous crises troubling the country. Int'L, opposition president of the African Congress for Progress, said, "We must not think about what Rwanda should be between. Rather, we need a real dialogue that brings together all the sons and daughters of the Congo." President Denis Sassou Nguesso and his Congo Labour Party controversially won re-election last March. He's been in power for a total of 38 years. The government has supported the dialogue as essential to achieve consensus ahead of the legislative vote to be held in 5 months. The ruling party is keen to maintain an overwhelming majority. Nonetheless, the opposition has asked for an organized dialogue, which power sharing, constitutional reforms, and the release of political prisoners. Vital among them is General Jean-Marie Michael Mokoko, a former commander who questioned Sassou for the presidency in 2016. He was charged with treason and convicted. Finally, students from Morocco escaping Ukraine arrive in Casablanca. Moroccan students evacuated from Ukraine on Wednesday finally reached their country. The North African Kingdom is organizing repatriation flights from Bucharest, Budapest, and Warsaw. It is the end of a traumatic experience in Ukraine for these Moroccan students who arrived at the Mohammed V International Airport in Casablanca. Numerous can't forget the hazardous journey they embarked on to escape the war. Afaf particularly recalls the treatment she experienced along the road. She said, "Our exit from Ukraine was difficult because Ukrainians were racist to us. During our crossing from the borders, Morocco provided us with hotel, transportation, and food for free. It was necessary to move away from the Ukrainian police who considered their citizens over us." Morocco has about 8,000 students admitted in Ukrainian universities. Other Arab governments are also preparing return flights. Egypt, the Arab world's most populous country, has 6,000 citizens in Ukraine, more than half of whom are students in Kharkiv. Government spokesman Nader Saad said Tuesday afternoon an Egyptian plane went to Bucharest to repatriate Egyptian students in Romania. More than 660,000 people have fled Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion last week, the United Nations Refugee Agency said. That's International News Desk this Thursday. I am Lois Turaki reporting. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Good night.